Goeiemôre dames en here. Welkom by die 6de aanbieding hierdie week van Nasie in Gesprek. Ons hoop julle geniet hierdie interessante bespreking baie. Dankie ook aan die paneellede.
Value chains are the vital connections between producers and consumers. But as we've seen in the recent past, these connections can be disrupted or even severed. There is an opportunity for producers to change their approach to value chains, considering the latest technology and consumer preferences.
In recent years, the whole debate around inclusive value chains in agriculture has reignited. We have talked about value chains for a very long time. But in South Africa, if we take into consideration the nature of our industry, where we have small producers, large producers, we have small processors, very large processors, inclusive value chains is a very important principle, and we need to have a very clear understanding of what each stakeholder in the value chain can contribute. Overall, 50% of our industry's value is actually coming from export, so we need to be globally competitive. How do we build competitive value chains to feed into these export markets where we have to face international competition head on? Many of those industries are actually enjoy direct support from government. The recently signed Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan is actually based on the principle of inclusive value chains. And this is something that many stakeholders often don't recognize within the master plan. There's a lot of politics involved in the master plan. But if you really go to the essence of the master plan and the proposed interventions, they are set up in a very specific way where there's opportunity for new entrants, whether these are farmers or small processors, and there's a specific space in the value chain for them to operate. But there's also space for the large-scale commercial operations. We have a growing urbanization. We have a lot more people that we need to feed in the cities. So this is where the majority of our supply chains need to supply food or into the international market. And where we have the smaller value chains, the informal value chains, can make a huge contributions to the rural food security and smaller households and smaller operations and supply chains. The question is just how can we work closer together, communicate better, and actually build more effective and sustainable value chains for all players in the agriculture sector.
It's long been said that producers can increase their margins by staying involved in the value chain for longer by adding value to their commodities.
The South African commercial agriculture value chain is highly sophisticated. We are indeed very privileged that this agriculture value chain secures food security for all of our people, not only at the local level, but also at the global level. It's very important that farmers co-own parts of this value chain. We've seen that in other parts of the world where farmers are highly successful and where food security is a priority for the government, those farmers own parts of the value chain. And it is through co-ownership that farmers can leverage it to their benefit and ensure that they remain profitable and that the country, in the last instance, also ensures food security for all of its people.
In this process, some links in the value chain can be vertically integrated to reach the end consumer sooner. The potential value to the consumer includes increased quality and lower costs.
With rising agritourism across South Africa, there is an economic case for farmers to add a bit more value and process some of their produce as a way to bring the consumer closer to their establishment to experience the farm life. But at a broader commercial scale, there is also an economic reason for people to add a bit more value to their produce. Technology offers opportunities for farmers to be involved in more than the primary level, but across the value chain of agriculture, food and beverages sector. And there is an economic case to be involved onto that. Their activities differ commodity by commodity, but there is a case for farmers to explore the opportunities that lie on the value chain and ensure that they are vertically integrated where economic conditions permit.
There's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to value chains and distribution models. Large-scale producers can develop their own infrastructure and networks to serve a specific consumer, but there's also an opportunity for smaller niche producers to develop their own targeted value chains. Value chains must constantly evolve to adapt to changing market conditions, whether it's logistical challenges or consumer preferences. The ability to adapt and adjust will set successful producers apart from those who are merely surviving.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session. Before we start with a formal session, there is a very special leading farmer in South Africa in the audience whose birthday is it today. So I'd just like to congratulate Mr. Kalis Kuman. Congratulations. I think not only are you a leading farmer from a farming perspective, but a leader in terms of providing mentorship to young farmers, both emerging farmers and young commercial farmers. So congratulations. We wish you a great day and a wonderful year. Thank you for attending this meeting. Well, this is the 55th year that we have NAMPO. It is the 12th year that we have these discussions, these Nation in Conversation discussions. And I'm privileged today to have both the CEO of Grain SA, who is the body organizing NAMPO, as well as Francois Strydom, the CEO of Senves, who has been the driving force behind this Nation in Conversation idea. This is the 12th year we have had these discussions, and Francois just said to me that last night the Nation in Conversation discussion was the headline news on the 7 o'clock news. So, Francois, I think this has been a great add-on, not only to NAMPO, but an add-on to the communication landscape in South Africa to highlight the critical issues, of which one of them we are talking today, the value chain. So, Francois, I think it's a great initiative, and I do think it adds massive value in terms of the South African media platform, not only for coverage of agriculture issues, but for discussing these issues.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with you. On my far side is Dr. Pieter Taljaard. He's the CEO of Grain SA. Pieter, welcome. Just as a kick-off, how is NAMPO going this year?
To you, good morning, and what a privilege. I think just to comment on Nation Conversation, I think what we have seen, the value of the conversation, and really the hard topics that have been covered over the years, and what it means, and just the ability in many of these conversations where people start far apart and they end closer together. And I think that's really the purpose of this. So we're privileged for Grain SA to be part of this in this partnership and to have this on the NAMPO. So yeah, we last week and the week before we had some rain in the Western Free State here, Botawil. We are blessed with good weather this year. Today is awesome, tomorrow a little bit colder. But yeah, the first day, Tuesday, about 16,000 people through the gates, which is a record for the first day, always on NAMPO. And yesterday, 24,500. So except for that one day that we had a public holiday in the past many years ago, this is also a record for the second day. So I just want to go out and thank all the exhibitors for coming out, doing all that, bringing their technology and the innovation. And then definitely the importance is the feed must be here, and the right feed must be here to come and to get the information. So yeah, we feel blessed and just want to thank everybody involved. This is a big team and an industry effort to have NAMPO.
I think for me, just in terms of the Nation in Conversation topics, how it's changed over the years. A few years ago, it was all about expropriation without compensation. It was a doom and gloom discussion. We've moved on where we are now discussing the real topics of the business of agriculture. How do you become successful? How do you take ownership? But it's almost as if that doom and gloom is lifted to say, we're in this situation, how are we going to get out of this and make agriculture a better industry? The other point for me that's always a highlight is if you look at the news of the day, if you look at the rest of the economy, agriculture is one of those forward-looking, energetic industries. There's plans, there's investment, there's ideas, there's technology, and that makes it's a massive difference to what you experience in the rest of the world. But let's start. The topic today is the agriculture value chain. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Pieter Taljaard from Grain SA, CEO of Grain SA, the grain value chain. Let's talk about a bit about the grain value chain.
Theo, Jan, just this past 2 days, we have seen it again, the value of partnerships and being connected and a competitive value chain, being effective. And also very important in our context in South Africa is really that access to the value chain. How can it be inclusive and also give access to different levels of businesses, the preference or the appetite that people will have in the business. So if you look at the grain value chain, for example, it's really, you can group it in 3 sectors. It's really the input supplying companies that supply the inputs. You have the producers that own or rent the land. They own or rent equipment where possible. And then you have the off-takers, which is crucial. Because what we need in South Africa is really, we need affordable food. We're actually a dry country. In the past 3 years, 4 seasons, we have been blessed with abundance of rain. It was good seasons. But we need to produce surplus commodity to have affordable food in this country. And once you have a surplus, you need to be able to export that. I like to refer to exhaust valve. You have to get some of the surpluses out to make space and also a pricing space for farmers to produce in the future. So for me in business, it's all about the risk and return, the investment versus the potential outcome. So the key thing, if you look at the primary producer, if you look at the farmer, is really how do you manage that risk? Because that risk can be, or return on your investment can vary from negative, from 0 up to 50% in certain years. So there's huge risk. And what we have seen, especially for the successful farmers, is how are you able to manage that risk? As soon as you can get to a point where you have a buffer and you can build a buffer and you can continue producing, because it will happen in some years, you will have a 0 return or a negative return in some years. And that's the focus for primary production, is really how do you manage that risk? But as I said, the links in the chain, some farmers prefer to either integrate backward or forward, and it's depending on their business model, their risk appetite that they want to do and how far they want to go. Certain farmers just tell you they want to focus, they want to specialize on production. Others say, yes, it's an opportunity to integrate forward in the value chain. So it varies, but it's all about that risk.
And it also depends on the kind of commodity, but we'll get to that a bit later. Francois Senwes, Francois is the CEO of Senwes. Senwes is a major player in this value chain, both from the point of providing services in this value chain, but also investment in this value chain to make the value chain work. From an investment business point of view, your view on the value chain?
Of course, it must make business sense. You know, whatever you do, money flows to where it can generate profit, where it can generate work opportunities. So it's a massive investment. And let me just quickly touch on that. So last year we exported SA agricultural value chains, $12.8 billion US. And that's a massive amount of inflow into our economy and job creation. That's the first thing. Remember that we have roughly 38 to 40 main commodities that we produce in South Africa. More of half of them are net exporters. Just the other day, 2012, we were net importers of red meat. Now we major exporters of red meat. You know, citrus we are one of the major players in the citrus industry. There's massive opportunity that is created and wealth. Remember in the COVID year, agriculture and primary agriculture was the only sector that grew positively and massively positively. Just this new information about job creation. We're one of the industries that grew in job creation. Not mining as you think. Mining declined. We increased. So, you know, if you stand back and you look at the massive input that agri and value chains has in the rural countryside, it would not exist if it weren't there.
And all these commodities that is exported comes through a value chain. Each and every one has to move through that. And Theo Boshoff is the CEO of Agbiz. These value chains differ from commodity to commodity. but each has to work. Can we just elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, no, absolutely, and thanks for the opportunity. So I think to pick up exactly what's already been said, the concept of partnerships within the business up and down the value chain, whether it's companies that integrate themselves vertically or whether it's bringing partner companies into your business as the primary producer. That really is where the value add comes from. And I really like that terminology that was used in the introduction video. It's about value add. Sometimes it can be processing, sometimes value add can take other forms. If I can take a good example, and I know often when we have the discussions, especially with DTIC and government, the sort of old mentality comes out, or we have these discussions to say, why do we export just raw agricultural products? Why is there no value add? I think the argument there would be is that processing is not always equal to value add. If you think about citrus, for instance, it's not the case where it was 20 years ago where you export, or if you're or the consumer looks for naartjies or apples, they look for Clement Gold, they look for Pink Lady. That actually showcases the value add in the partnerships right throughout from the input supplier, where it comes to the breeding of certain varieties, the marketing of those varieties, taking it all the way through primary production, through the marketing channels, and actually building that brand around, for instance, different varieties. So I think that showcases the kind of value add where partnerships create right up and down the value chain.
So if I walk into my Woolies in Sandton and I buy Clement Gold naartjies, there's a whole value chain behind that need to support that little sticker on the naartjie. It is not only the marketing right at the end.
Absolutely, and if you look at other value chains, for instance, it's very much the same. The meat industry, a lot of the feedlots, for instance, are building brands now. It's not chicken or beef anymore. It might be Quran beef or beef master that one's specifically looking for, or different Wagyu, for instance. So it is building that brand around it. I think it's quite important, not just locally in South Africa, but as was mentioned, these brands, and not just the brands in terms of companies, but varieties are becoming internationally well known, and that is how you start building, adding that value. Likewise, if you look at just the value of geographical origins, which is something that has become very, very important in the last 20 years, especially, for instance, in the meat sector as well as the wine sector, being able to get that recognition for the unique characteristics and actually the whole value chain that supports a product originating from a certain area of South Africa.
Now, Louis de Kock is right next to me. Louis, you're the founder of Nile.ag. Now, that is a complete different view of the traditional value chain. Just first explain what you do, and then I want to talk about your value chain.
Yes, Steve. So we run an online e-commerce platform that basically connects farmers directly to commercial buyers of fresh produce. And so instead of having a very localized marketplace, where farmers would send their produce to the nearest market to them, we enable farmers to market their produce all across Southern Africa and eventually all into the world through one single point of contact, which is an e-commerce platform. And so we try to digitize the process on the one hand, but also provide the logistics and the infrastructure to be able to actually fulfill those transactions.
So that is taking out certain elements of the traditional value chain, but also enable the functions, the logistics in the traditional value chain.
So I think it's very important if we look at e-commerce that we think very holistically about the technology that we create. So it's not sufficient just to look at the digitization of a transaction, because that part is quite easy. It's easy to digitize a transaction, you automate the workflow. But to have a value-adding new channel that can create a lot of value for farmers, we need to be able to digitize the entire transaction process, meaning from the logistics side of things, the reverse logistics, payments, the provenance of a certain product. So it's really important that when we create these new channels, that we think holistically of it. We should not think of it as a silver bullet and just digitize the point of transaction, but again, think more holistically.
So the website is only one thing. It is actually not about the website.
So if you think internationally about very successful e-commerce businesses like Alibaba, like Amazon, the value add that they bring is not so much the digitization of the transaction, because again, anyone can do that. It's very easy to start an online shop. The fact that they're able to create a way more sufficient or extensive value chain through logistics, through payment infrastructure, and the fact that they can get produce in a more efficient way from where it's produced to where it's consumed, that actually creates the value. And it's because they're bringing technology throughout the entire process that it is valuable, and not so much as the fact that it's digitized or the fact that it looks like it's online.
Francois noted the fact that it must always make commercial sense. It must be, from an investment point of view, the risk-return ratio must make sense for whoever plays in that value chain. How does that, when you disrupt the traditional value chain, how does that approach work?
Yes, so of course through technology we are able to eliminate many intermediaries in the process, and also because you digitize the process, it means you can automate a lot of the process. So it means you take people out of the trading process, and of course the process becomes more efficient, more cost-effective in a sense. So that's one part of it. The second part is the fact that we can actually get produce to travel in the most effective way from where it's produced to where it's consumed. So it means we shorten the value chain, and at the end there's a lot more to share for everyone within the value chain. So fewer intermediaries, produce traveling directly to where there's the biggest need for those produce, and then again the fact that we can eliminate a lot of the intermediaries that we would typically have within the value chain.
Louis, you touched on international. Now, Cyril Prinsloo is specifically knowledgeable and a specialist on international requirements, not only on the product, but on the value chain. Can you give us a broad spectrum from an international perspective? What is required from a value chain?
Absolutely, Theo. I think one of the things we've seen over the last couple of years, we know, especially when we look at sustainability throughout the value chain, right? In the past, it was very much driven by consumers, right? Consumers wanting organic produce, locally sourced goods, wanting responsibly sourced goods. But I think what we've seen specifically in the last couple of years is a move away from that kind of consumer-driven demand for sustainability in produce towards regulatory demands, right? Increasingly, we see in the European Union, we saw in the recent the new NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, a lot stronger regulation regarding environmental regulations in trade, right? And I think that is something that South African producers need to be very cognizant of, because essentially if we don't, across different steps throughout our value chains of production, if we don't focus on, increasing the sustainability, limiting carbon dioxide emissions, we'll be increasingly locked out of those markets, right? We'll be facing additional tariffs, whether it's in the European carbon tariffs. So I think that's something that we really need to consider when we think about South African production. Eventually, it's going to come down to we need to enhance sustainability throughout production of agricultural goods.
But that means that for South Africa to enter various markets, does each and every market have different requirements from a value chain perspective?
I think that's increasingly the problem we're facing, right? European Union has different regulations regarding environmental sustainability, the US markets, Canada, etc. And I think, from a European perspective, what they're saying is we have these stringent regulations around, say, goods that's produced, but there's stringent regulation around carbon dioxide emissions, right? Producers from outside of Europe, they don't face that, so that gives them an unfair advantage in the European market. That's why they want to introduce these kind of carbon tariffs. I think the reality, and here a key critique from many developing countries, is that we know in Europe, we know in North America, they've often used various trade measures as non-tariff barriers to stymie imports from third parties. I mean, here in South Africa, the example of citrus black spot in Europe is very prominent. We know Namibia last year, for the first time, managed to export beef after 20 years of negotiations with the US around SPAs, around standards. And I think, part of this discussion is also what can industry bodies do around some of these issues, and to monitor, that these markets don't use environmental regulations as a non-tariff barrier that hinders South Africa's exports to these markets.
I want to touch on a few points, but Francois, then we also have in the grain value chain, if we come back to the grain value chain, there's an informal element to that value chain. Where does that fit into the value chain?
So if you look at total production, not only in grain, but all commodities, and it's difficult to trace the exact stats, but more than 40% move through the informal sector.
An informal value chain then?
Yes. So the traders next to the road that you think is insignificant, 40%, and I think that figure is growing day by day, moves through that product. Chickens and whole cobs of grain are prepared and quickly taken up. And it provides, remember, that provides for that specific family. It gives that children of the mama next to the road access to schooling and. The one thing that I wanted to add to both what Louis and Cyril said is that the digitalization, and once you're into a country, brings more than that. It brings transparency, it brings identity, it brings tracking. So you can't just move into, for instance, America. That's the first step, and it's a hell of a lot of hard work to get there. But then you have to enter the specific retail sector, and they have very specific issues on top of that.
Each retailer.
Each retailer. And remember, the power lies with the consumer. So whoever buys the product has immediate access to say, but this doesn't taste right,
And
There's
we'll
something
just not buy it
wrong
again.
with it. And that immediately flows back to the producer somewhere in South Africa, who has to then explain or change and be resilient to accept that. So that it brings direct contact between the consumer and the producer. And digitalization and tracking of that whole value chain brings that closer to home. So in a way, I think grain farmers are maybe the least or of the least exposed to that. They deliver their product in a silo. But that doesn't happen with a citrus farmer. He and she is directly in contact with the end consumer. Grain is going to become, and if I look forward, if I track forward, that is going to happen with each commodity. You will not be shielded from the end consumer. And that's not a bad thing. It is a hugely progressive thing. It means that you have to adopt and change and be, as a country and as a producer in South Africa, you have to be world-class and world competitive.
I'm going to get back to the role, specifically Cyril and Louis, about social media in terms of the communication lines from the consumer side. But just a comment, what for me is very interesting is in Johannesburg, anywhere where you see a building site going up, it's early morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, the food that is delivered into that value chain. I don't know where they do it, but you see a specific round plastic holder with a kind of a vetkoek in them. You see trays of eggs being delivered, probably hard-boiled eggs, but that value chain within a day of a building site going up, there's a whole food value chain from the informal sector moving into that value chain. And there must be a system behind that. Somebody at 4 o'clock this morning started baking the vetkoeks. Somebody put the mince in the vetkoek, and in the end it gets delivered as the workers arrive on site. There's an informal food value chain. But Pieter, if we come back to grain for a minute, one of the issues about the value chain is how do we make sure that we create space for the new farmer, the more traditional farmer, to get into that value chain, simply because it is extremely expensive if you're outside of any formal value chain to be able to produce in a competitive environment. from a Grain SA point of view, getting new farmers into the value chain, how do you approach that?
Theo, I think it's very important, and Francois touched on it, and I also want to add to that. I think grain at this stage is in a sense, still isolated from that. So it's becoming more and more important, and we are trying proactively to take control of that. So if you look at the grain and oil complex, there's already 2 examples in terms of the barley industry as well as the canola industry, where there's passport, we call it a grain passport or oilseed passport system, where they want to track it right from the production, everything that's used. So that is definitely going to become more and more important. And as I said, Grain SA is trying to proactively take control of that and really to make sure we do it. Remember, there's also a big difference if you look at developed countries versus developing countries, what Cyril touched on in terms of getting those protocols in place to get access. In developed countries, the government does it. In South Africa, we need to assist to that. But getting back to your question, if you look at grain farming, the land value varies from, I think in the West, 15,000 Rand per hectare to 80,000 in some of your higher potential dry land or rain-fed areas. And for irrigation, it can go up to 350,000 Rand in terms of the value of the land also. So on top of that, you need your variable inputs, and that roughly for dry land, and I'm not going to go into details, can be around 18,000 Rand per hectare, of which the land can be about 2,000 to 3,000 Rand, and then the mechanization, depreciation, fertilizer, depending on what you plant and the commodity and so forth. So it's really expensive, but on top of the 18 to 80,000 that you can, or that you need in terms of investment on primary land, you need an additional 8 to 10,000 Rand just in terms of loose assets or machinery and equipment, what you need to do that. So these are the barriers to entry really to do into that. So despite the fact that it's really low value commodities compared to other produce, it's really, the scale is important to get into that. Because if you want to get to an 8 to 10,000 Rand investment in machinery, you must have a certain level of scale to be able to afford that or to get into that. So these are the barriers to entry. And exactly to your point, if you look at small scales and having access to that, that's really one of the biggest challenges. And if you look at developing producers today, mechanization is key. And the time frame, coming back to the risk that I've mentioned earlier, timing in grain production, I agree also in others, but in grain production specifically, the time frame between a record crop and a failure can be 2 days. If you miss your opportunity to plant, or you miss the harvest, or whatever, it's really so fine. So being on time, being able to do the job when the time is right is crucial, and that's one of the key challenges for developing farmers. So what Grain SA has done over, I think, 12 years already, started a farmer development program, and really helping young, small-scale producers, right from below 1 hectare, and growing them, teaching them, first of all, the business principles, but then also, secondly, the assistance and mentorship on the farm to use the right inputs in the right place. So it's so sophisticated today. The cultivars and fertilizer that you use on different farms vary significantly. So it's really that mentorship and information and support that you need to give those farmers to be able to become effective or to produce a profit. But then getting back to the risk, once you are in this chain, you must be able to manage that over a period of time and being effective. So in many cases, technology do help farmers. Take, for example, Roundup. They can free up a lot of the family labor, or even school children not being needed in the field by just spraying Roundup. So you can save a lot of time, and other technologies, they can really fast track the production efficiency in the chain. But the mechanization and that access to the land is really the key things that we need to drive and assist these chains with.
Theo, I'm going to pick on a point that Peter made. And that point was that in developed countries, the government plays a massive role in assisting the monitoring of the value chains, the opening up of markets, and assist the value chain to enter a market. He noted that in South Africa, unfortunately, a lot of that rests with organized agriculture. Where does that rest, and how do we approach that?
I think it's certainly a dual responsibility. So organized agriculture associations like ourselves, we have obviously the obligation to to work with government to ensure that new markets are opened up, that the requirements are met. But ultimately, one can't completely step into their shoes. And this is maybe sometimes where I differ with some opinion to say that, we don't need government as a sector. There are certain things that certainly I think we do need. If you're sort of breaking it down to the different elements of different value chains, for export, for instance, trade agreements can only be negotiated by government. Yes.
Government to government.
Government to government. So business associations, working with foreign business associations can motivate. We try to get the information together, provide that evidence base based on the criteria for what the benefits versus the disadvantages would be of new agreements. But ultimately, it's a government-to-government agreement. Likewise, sanitary and phytosanitary protocols, exactly the same thing. But then if I want to take it a little bit, if I can link it to government's role also to ensure inclusivity in value chains, removing some of these barriers to entry. So we recently had quite a good engagement. We submitted formal comments to the Competition Commission on the fresh produce market inquiry. And I think that's a very good example maybe of where some of the perceptions or incorrect perceptions where associations and private sector also needs to assist government to correct some of these misperceptions. So essentially the question was, do exports and do the established value chains increase the barriers to entry and make it more difficult for new entrants into the sector? I would argue that, notwithstanding, and certainly I think these elements, the financing element, the access to land, those are significant challenges. But to a large extent, market access and getting new entrants into the value chains will be assisted by the various value chain players and interdependency within value chains. The whole concept of having from input suppliers to marketers being essentially part of the business, opposed to simply service providers, to the primary agricultural sector, that actually means that new entrants already have potential partners the second they enter into the sector. So I think that's quite an important aspect. And I think if I can just latch on to Francois' point as well. Ultimately, it's up to each business to decide what would you compete on. Do you compete on quality? Do you compete on price? Do you compete on volumes? But it's vital that we maintain the critical infrastructure for all of these different value chains. Of course, if you look at our food sector and to a lesser extent vegetables, a lot of it is exported, the higher value, more scientifically produced crops. But there is a significant portion of it that, and you need to have that market linkages for the typical bakkie traders. People that want to come with, a half-ton of bakkie full of potatoes or oranges that they grew themselves. And yes, it might not be the same quality, and hence there will be, the market will perhaps force the price down. But it's something like the municipal fresh produce markets is an incredibly important tool that has to be maintained to ensure that we don't have a single marketing channel. Typically, exports, there's retailers, there's local and international, but as Francois mentioned, 40% especially of our fresh produce actually goes to the informal market. The hawkers, the informal traders that you see exactly at the construction sites, they rely very heavily on the municipal fresh produce market, and it's vital that we don't lose sight of those. And I think, unfortunately, in the space of about 10 years, a lot of that infrastructure has gone quite backwards. And I don't think that's necessarily a fault of any of the rest of the industry. It's simply a matter that of the funds generated there needs to be reinvested, and there needs to be the recognition that those are also vital for access to market. Because ultimately, the export, the retailers, and the fresh produce markets don't directly compete with each other. They serve different clients, and I think they're all complementary.
I want to take the discussion back to a point that Francois made. And that is the point of the consumer in the end. The consumer in the end needs to buy the apple or buy the whatever the produce they want to buy. And I want to view this conversation from 2 points. First of all, Francois' point that the consumer has got a direct, almost communication back to the whole value chain, to the producer. If we add social media to that, if you add the platform that everybody has to create publicity, how do you view that, Louis? In your business, you're based on a digital delivery system, which means you're already in that space. How does that integrate with your business model?
Yes, so Theo, obviously we have to distinguish between business-to-business models and business-to-consumer models. And for business-to-consumer models to work, you need a certain amount of scale and you need the average order values to be significant enough to make sense to deliver directly to consumers. So for instance, to deliver a packet of, say, apples directly to a consumer is not really viable in a sense. So it means there will always be a threshold before a farmer can really deliver directly onto the end consumer. So we have to be realistic about that. Of course, there are many models outside that suggest that it could be possible. From our perspective, in most instances, there needs to be like an intermediary or at least a platform that can connect that supply to the demand, but they can also make sure that there's a viable delivery into the end consumer. Now, if we look at international markets, we have many examples of what we call social commerce. So for instance, in China, we've got what we call Pinduoduo, one of the biggest agtech businesses in the world. And they rely on social commerce, so the idea of the end consumer buying in groups together from smaller farmers and using social media as a tool to basically get information about the products and also giving feedback about the products that they've acquired directly from a farm. So certainly that's possible, but again, we have to make sure that the supply chain is viable and that it actually makes sense to deliver those products directly to the end consumer. And then you are right, in that instance where we deliver directly into an end consumer, social media plays a big part in providing feedback, providing also access, information to people in a localized market about products that's available from a farm.
Cyril, from your point of view, we've touched on the element that almost the go-to when people talk about the value chain in terms of commodity is to try to brand the commodity. Either if it's tomato, ZZ2 extremely successful in that, or even Wilde Klaver successful in certain of their products, or we talked about Clement Gold successful in the products. Where does that fit into the international market?
Theo, I think that's a very good question. Before we touch on that, I just quickly wanted to follow up on a point that Theo raised around the role of government in facilitating trade and facilitating value chains. And you're absolutely right. There's certain domains that's just in the domain of governments, one of which is negotiating trade deals, right? And I think one of the things, again, looking at the broader perspective, bringing that back to South Africa, one of the things that's the most exciting for me is over the last 5 years, South Africa, along with the 55-odd AU member states, have been negotiating the Continental Free Trade Agreement, right? And I think, and I see you're shaking your head as well, when we're thinking about trading across borders, I mean, it's phenomenal. We're talking about 1.2 odd billion people, duty-free tariff trade across the continent. You mentioned earlier, around 13 billion of exports, agricultural exports from South Africa last year. About a third of that, 4.75, was to our continent. And that's very much concentrated in SACU, so the BLNS countries, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, Eswatini, to a lesser extent SADC, right? Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique. And we see how successful those free trade agreements have been to get produce from South Africa to these markets. And on the back of that, again, this is why for me it's such an exciting opportunity, this Continental Free Trade Agreement, to create that regulatory framework for South African producers to take our goods across the continent. Of course, we know it's not a silver bullet. Anybody that trades with the continent knows that tariffs is not your biggest barrier. It's the NTBs, right? It's the bureaucracy, it's the red tape, it's the logistics. But certainly, I think, again, coming from a South African agricultural perspective, very encouraging, and certainly governments are taking a lead role in those negotiations.
Just, Peter, from your point of view, we noted that and I'm going to give you first an example that I experienced. I have a family that farms with grapes, wine grapes delivered to a wine cooperative seller. And the difference in quality that the seller pays to the member farmers has increased over the last decade handsomely, but not 10 or 20%, 200 or 300%, in order to make sure that the farmer, the producer, uses, first of all, the right variety, but also delivers the right quality. So that value chain is enhancing the behavior of the producer. In the grain industry, where does that fit into?
I think it's very important too, and it's actually a very relevant topic at the moment. It's a key thing, the grading that you have, or the system that you have to look at the quality must really, as far as possible, or as close as possible, reflect the inherent value of the commodity that you have. And that sends the signal back to the producer. So the producer will only react on the price. As Francois said earlier, it will follow the money. So the key thing is consumer preferences, the way in which we process, the technology that we use also change over time. So grading regulations of grains also need to adjust. And we had experience in the maize industry today, and it's crucial. South African producers want to produce high quality, safe food. That's the key thing. There's no negotiations on quality and food safety, specifically when it comes to that. But we also need to be able to adopt, keep these value chains competitive. That means that there's new varieties, new cultivars coming in, and then you sit with climatic conditions. Remember, this is not engineering, it's a biological live organism that we work with. So we need to make sure that the grading systems that we have are also really representing the quality. And the quality will come from the consumer via the value chain, the processing, back to the farmer. And that must be accurately. So the better you can grade your products, the easier it is, the better the mechanism that you will send through. And I mean, in the oilseed industry, currently, there's no analysis or no evaluation or grading in terms of the oil content in the product. And it's a contentious discussion that we have. Should we go into that direction or not? And we have seen in the grain and the oilseed many examples of that, going back to wheat and so forth. So the grading is really the mechanism via which you give the signal back to the producer, and that's a key issue.
Can I add to that? So grain, the identity of grain becomes known once the miller has milled it, or the extraction has been done by the oil seed production. Then there's identity. Now, first of all, that point of contact, the miller will, for instance, look at extraction, because the extraction percentage, is directly linked to his profitability. So the first sort of sign given back to the producer
is at that point.
I want maize that has a higher extraction percentage. But that you will see as this develops. The secondary things will now it will become, it's quantitative, and then it will become qualitative. Yeah. So the consumer will ask, and they should ask, but I want to know what's in this maize, because I realize that there's chemicals sprayed on it and there's a carbon footprint behind it. I want to know what happens. Are there child labor, for instance, involved in the production? How are the workers treated while producing those products? So those are all, the informed consumer gives the signal, and they draw all of the financial value back to the production process.
In the grain industry, I know in the fruit industry, I was a while ago in Europe, in Belgium, and on this piece of meat that you buy, there's a picture of the farmer, and there's a code, a website link to that farm. You can actually, if you want to, you can look at the farm, but there's a picture of the farmer on the piece of meat. Now, obviously, that is almost the top end of tracing, where they put a name and a label to it. But in grain, the simple effect of the quality that's discovered at the miller, how does that feed all the way back to the farmer? Is there a process? Is there a way that, or is that something that are we going to develop towards?
Within that process of developing, it's still, I think, highly unsophisticated. The players in the grain industry almost want to get rid of the product to the next player, and then says, well, I've done my work. It's now your responsibility. While if you put the citrus industry and the value chain behind it, they're not trying to get rid of the product. They're trying to enhance the product.
And keep ownership in the...
And identity, so that they can capture that value. So I think it's something that the grain industry needs to think very hard about how do we follow the examples of more sophisticated value chains.
Too, and I think that the nature of the product is that's unique, and as we said, the difference between the value chain. So, because of the bulkiness of grain, it's very difficult to have a traceable system, and with that difficulty comes also the opportunity to hide, or basically, producers get paid on the average. So, a miller will have an average extraction from that grain that he mill, and then he will pay on the average, but we know in terms of statistic there's a normal curve, and it can vary significantly from one season to the other, depending on the cultivar that you plant or how you fertilize. There's many drivers of this quality in terms of the extraction, for example. Whiteness is another one in terms if you think about maize meal. So there's way in which a farmer can do it, but I think the exciting thing of where we sit today and what's happening here around us is in the future it might become possible, and what we have seen fairly recently in terms of technology and cameras and so forth, that on the go, on the fly, I just wonder how long it will take, that while a grain farmer is combining his product, you might get the type of analysis of what goes through the system. And once you send that up into the cloud to your off-taker, then you can start to have a significant, which is a different approach from what we today. Today you throw it in a bunk, a silo, and Francois, how big is the average silo? So it basically loses its identity. But in the future, these type of things becomes possible because of technology.
Well, just an example of that. So we've already tried to discover that value. So PepsiCo, the old Pioneer Foods, we will now share the value if there's a higher extraction process. So try and identify it, isolate it, take it through the system, measure it, and see what the value add is. And the next step will be now incentivize the farmer.
Yes. And the whole chain will adapt to that pricing change.
Absolutely.
And I just want to emphasize again what I saw in the last 20 years in the a farmer farming with grapes delivering to a cooperative seller. How that farmer in 20 years has completely changed the way that they operate, the way that they treat, the way that they reduce the size of the harvest to get quality. It's a complete behavior change once the pricing differences are there. I see we're 55 minutes into the discussion. I'm going to allow a few questions and then we will take the discussion further. Is there anybody that would like to ask any question or a comment to the panel? Any questions? Yes, there at the back.
Hi, my name is Morgan. I was just wondering, with narrowing farm profit margins, and if we look at who's really drawing value from the value chain, it's the supermarkets and those intermediaries who are really absorbing most of the value and making the most profit in the value chain. And I was wondering if it's something any of you have engaged with, is how you actually balance that, because the farmers aren't making most of the profit and it's the consumers are paying the higher prices, and where the value is really lying is with these supermarkets. And I was just wondering if there's any efforts to interrogate their really crucial role and the value that they're drawing from the system.
Great question. I think let's any other questions? Let's take that topic. Let's start with that topic, Francois.
So, perception is fact, unfortunately, and the mere perception that retailers attract the most value or profit, it is not factually true. So you have to look at the investment and then relative to that. So we've done a lot of work, and some of my people sit here. We've done the hard yards on the analysis of that. If you look at all the value chains, what we did, and this takes years to really sophisticate to the level where you have transparency on that. So what you do is you physically trace in a value chain the players, and you interrogate their financial results. And then you see what is their profit relevant to the investment that they make. Now the perception, and I had that perception myself, Morgan, that the value lies at the end of the value chain. It is factually untrue. It lies in certain areas much more in the middle of the value chain. And in some years, it also varies. But to make the statement that it lies with the retailer is just factually untrue. It's a popular thing to say, but it's not true. So let me use this acronym. It's a poisonous assumption. So can I use this? So you sit around the fire and you say, Julius Malema is an idiot. It's very popular to say that. Is it true? It isn't. It is not. If you engage with him, then you realize that you might not, concur with what he says, but he's certainly not stupid. So you be very careful not to make assumptions about things. Let me use another example that's very pertinent now. So the way that all of us grew up is that, Russia is the enemy and America is the friend. So what happens if a citrus farmer gets a better price and entrance of his product into Russia? Will you, because of the perception that we have, not want him to extract that value? Certainly you would want to extract that value. So be very careful. And that's important in your personal life. Test your own personal perceptions about things. They might not be the truth.
Thanks, dear. If I can just add one thing. I mean, the whole concept, we obviously used to have controlled marketing boards, but we've moved now into sort of a liberalized system. And I think the basis of a free market economy is, and I've heard it a couple of times now, so you follow the money. So where business sees business opportunities, where they see profit, that's where they'll go. And I think that's why, and perhaps something that gives credence to what Francois mentioned, is if you look at the diversity within agriculture, you have companies that integrate so vertically all the way up to the point where they actually have their own brands for their products at the supermarket, or even beyond the supermarket, as was mentioned now with virtual platforms, etc. Other producers have preferred to focus on one area of the value chain. And I think the reason for that is they obviously make the decisions based on where they see the most value for themselves in the value chain. So I would also just agree that I think it's difficult to make sort of generalizations about who in the value chain makes the most money, and this is also part of the inputs we made to the Competition Commission, is it ultimately becomes a business opportunity, and there's opportunities up and down the value chain. It's really up to each business to decide where in the value chain they want and to what extent they want to be involved in different areas of the value chain.
But yes.
Steven, I think the key thing, as we said, risk is very important. But when you look at this, it's partnerships in the value chain. And Francois mentioned the word transparency, and I think that's what we're moving towards, is without a proper high-level technology input supplying sector, farmers can't produce any product. They can't be profitable. They can't be competitive. If there's no farmers, there's no processing and off-taking agreement. So we need each other in this chain. We need to work together, and everybody needs to be able to make profit, because without profitable and sustainable profitable primary farm level production, there's no need to have an input sector, and there's no processing needed. So if you don't have a profitable and competitive value chain, there's no business.
But that profit links to the risk that the party takes in the value chain.
It should, and the free market should drive that and assist it, and that's why we need this transparency and these partnerships, because the better you, as Francois said, you understand your partner in the value chain, the better you understand how to work and how to continue to make business in the future.
Theo, I want to pick another point that was noted very broadly because it links to Megan's point. The role of the fresh produce markets relative to direct delivery to the to retailers. Lots of people, the comment is that in the UK that role is slightly shifted. But it also emphasizes the importance of a market where the price is discovered. Your view on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, again, it comes down to sort of a business decision. But a lot of the price discovery for fresh produce market obviously does take place in the negotiations on the market. And again, that price discovery mechanism, I think, is perhaps not always understood very well. the fresh produce market agent, who obviously acts on behalf of the producer and has to find the seller, the market does provide that feedback system that I think gives integrity to the price discovery mechanism in terms of there's competition on the market. There's lots of different producers. There's thousands of different buyers. There's also lots of different agents. If you were to be prejudicial to one side of it, either the buyers or the sellers, from a market agent's point of view, they'd very quickly find a different market agent. So I do think that sort of a feedback system in the fresh produce markets does ensure that there's a credible market discovery mechanism. The direct selling, obviously through the retailing chains, that's a different element. The price discovery mechanisms there are obviously that's more contractual of a contractual nature. But I do think some of the systemic challenges faced by the fresh produce market would also make it attractive in terms of maintaining the quality of your products. We do unfortunately have some real challenges with infrastructure in the fresh produce markets, ripening rooms, cold chain rooms, etc. that aren't functioning quite well. So it's up to ultimately the seller, the producer, to decide. We'll get the most benefit from his product. And one thing, again, I might be guilty of a generalization now, but typically selling direct and being able to control the entire cold chain, especially for fresh produce, would be another advantage that maybe fresh produce markets don't give you.
Yes, I do agree to some extent with what you said. Perhaps the only thing to mention is that fresh produce markets are very localized in its nature, right?
Yes.
So a given price indication, say at the Johannesburg market, may not be reflective of the entire value chain. In fact, that typically represents between 5 and 10% of all the fresh produce traded in the region, right? So perhaps eventually the most sophisticated mechanism would be the ability to aggregate data across the entire value chain. So meaning understanding what happens at retailers, understanding what happens in informal markets, in export markets, and the cost differentials between all these markets. That perhaps should eventually become the fairest and the most transparent way to look at pricing mechanisms, where I agree the fresh produce markets would be but one input into that entire mechanism.
Are we moving towards that direction?
We are certainly moving into that direction, and so again, digitization aids us a lot in that process. South Africa's fresh produce markets are also very sophisticated in international terms. So the fact that we can go online and check what is the pricing at any given fresh produce market in South Africa for a given commodity is, world class in its sense. And the ability to integrate data of those nature with what is happening at retailers, what's happening at wholesalers, to the point where it comes from the consumer, the data, say, from individual stores in deep rural areas. And the ability to aggregate all that data into one data set, that should eventually give us the most fair and most transparent way of looking at price formation rather than just looking at one agent at a given market, say, in a given locality.
Maybe just to add to this discussion around digitalization, tracking in the value chain, there's a lot of focus nowadays on just the tracking element of it, right? And certainly one of the key benefits we see when companies, producers or companies, they tie into global value chains, we see there's a significant technology transfer, specifically around digitalization of production from these lead firms to other firms. Again, it's technology, it's investment, it's capacity building to use these new technology, these tools to produce more efficiently, effective. So I think when we think about value chains, we think about production. I think that's also certainly something we need to keep in mind is working with lead firms globally.
And I think coming back to the difference between the value chains, if you go back to the difference between the fresh produce market and grain, you need in a free market, you need an effective price discovery mechanism. And I think we all know that the only constant is change, and things have changed. And given the situation in terms of infrastructure, the road network and so forth, what we see with the maintenance, things change. And specifically in terms of the grain, we have the South African Futures Exchange, which is a platform where the price discovery really gives you indication of the future. And that's another example where the industry really needs to work together, because the location differentials can change from one month to the other. A road might not be accessible, so a certain 100 kilometers doesn't have a fixed price in South Africa anymore. It depends on the road that you need to travel. It depends on your loading place and offloading place. So there's various. For example, there's there's off-takers and millers in the western part of Pretoria where if you park there overnight, your truck can get damaged. Yeah, they steal the tires and the pipes of the truck. They steal diesel out of the tank. So it's difficult to quantify a certain price per kilometer. And I think those are the premiums and price mechanisms that need to come through. And those are the things that we are currently in South Africa work on to make sure that it's an effective way in which prices can go through. So I think that's another example where the industry really needs to work together to understand that the different location can have a different differential, and that's the signal back to the producer, what to produce, in which year, and by which quantity.
Before I go into closing comments, because we're slowly running out of time, any other questions? Firstly, Megan, thank you. You created a whole new discussion. And may I ask, Francois, is there somebody that Megan can talk to just to share a bit of that research?
Debbie Bester right in front.
Megan, Debbie Bester right in front. You can talk to her specifically about your question and the analysis that Francois was referring to. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay, if there's no other questions, I'm going to ask a final round of comments or questions from everybody, and that's linked to, we have a current value chain responsibilities, risk, return, investments as it's now. If you look at opportunities going forward, both from a producer point of view, but also from owners and players in the value chain, what is the direction we're moving in, and what are you seeing in the next few years? And I'm going to start with you, Theo. I think from ag business point of view, you do a lot of research in terms of, you even noted towards we need to create sustainability index or sustainability factors. And that is part and parcel of everybody in the value chain. How do you see the value chain play out for the different industries, and what should farmers on the one side, but also investors in the value chain keep in mind?
So I think there's obviously a number of things. Definitely the one trend I think that we're seeing in South Africa for various aspects, and I think this probably cuts across all the different value chain, is we're moving towards greater efficiency. And it's probably out of need, and I think it's a good thing to do, but that must also be supported again by organizations to ensure that we have access to the latest technology, as Peter mentioned, that we continuously don't rest on our laurels and to say we have our traditional market access. Africa's opening up now, which I think is a fantastic point, but at the same time, we also need to look at new markets. In negotiating new markets, perhaps, I know some of them, India, China, will always be very controversial with, if you think about the trade-offs maybe for other industries, but the likes of Thailand, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Japan, South Korea. So we need to ensure that we have an open enough system to allow the ingenuity of entrepreneurship to drive these efficiencies, that there's sufficient capability to do so.
And that means we need an absolute free market in terms of capital allocation in the value chain.
Yes.
Otherwise, we are not going to get there.
Yeah.
Cyril, your view in terms of how you see the international markets develop. You've noted some of it, but if you were to look forward 5-10 years, what should a South African producer or investor in the value chain, what should they start to factor into their decision making?
Theo, I think that's a brilliant question. I think one of the major themes, and we've kind of skirted around it a little bit already this morning, but over the last 10 years, we've seen increased tension between the US and China on the one hand. But we know as South Africa, yes, US is one of our major export markets, the EU as well, but so is China. I mean, we're talking 1.4 billion people, so is India, a lot of the Asian markets. And I think what we're seeing in the geopolitical space is there's this kind of polarization. Either you're with China or you're with the US, and you can't. And I think especially for countries such as South Africa, it shouldn't be a zero-sum game we should be able to have good relations with China, and we should be able to have good relations with the US. It shouldn't be zero-sum game. And I think, and again, this is where industry bodies really needs to come in and say, South Africa, we can't lose our AGOA access because our wine industry is going to hurt our citrus industry. But at the same time, let's participate in BRICS because we get privileged access to China to iron out trade issues or, you know. So I think that is, for me, one of the key takeaways is, you know, the role of industry bodies.
But that also means that it places a very difficult and precarious mandate on government in terms of trying to sit on the fence and be everybody's friend. Am I reading you correct?
Absolutely, but remember, it's not just South Africa. You know, it's about. You know, we did some research a couple of months ago. It's around, you know, 100-odd countries that's in that precarious space of being pragmatic about their foreign policy, about their economic diplomacy. And then you asked about the next 5-10 years. I think countries are going to learn how to navigate that space.
Well, take India. They buy oil, cheap oil from Russia, and they supply humanitarian aid to the Ukraine. That is how you sit. But your members, Peter, your message to your members in terms of staying relevant. We've got a great, efficient, effective, healthy grain value chain, but the world is changing continuously. Consumers changing, regulations are changing, technology is changing. The advice to farmers in terms of the next 5 or 10 years, where do you see the value chain change?
I think it's important just quickly to link up what Cyril is saying. This year, for example, because of low river levels in the US, for example, South Africa had the opportunity to export white maize to Mexico. It's not an annual thing, but the market opened up. We had surplus, and we could take advantage of that opportunity. So I think the importance is it's probably wishful thinking that all markets will be open at all time, but I think that's what we said proactively. Grain SA have been involved with the rest of the industry to make sure that the export protocols are in place. And if you look at the success story, I don't want to take too much time of soy in the last 20 years. We moved from being a net importer of oil cake. Now we are exporting soybeans. And hopefully in the future, exporting soybean oil cake. And proactively, 3 years ago, we started putting that protocols in place. And now, this year, when we are producing surpluses, the market is open. So effectively, so the key focus for us is really focus on the sustainable profitability. Within the ambit that really we need to get access to our smaller producers and make sure that as efficient as possibly we can give access to these smaller producers also as part of the value chain. And the nice thing about it, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So what we do for the commercial farmer is also good for the smaller.
Slightly different. A producer in the normal value chain, how should they view themselves to remain relevant, but also to make sure that they earn the best return on their capital investment given the risk that they are taking?
So the trends that we've been seeing over the past couple of years is that farmers, especially younger farmers, tend to be less loyal to existing channels. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Perhaps for incumbents, it's not the best of things. But I think to be rational about the channels that you use, to be objective of it, to be able to ascertain which are like the most efficient or the most cost effective, and eventually like to safeguard your business and to be sure that you can actually market your produce through new channels that will become more relevant over time, I think is probably, if I was a farmer, the way I would think about it. What is wrong is to suggest that digitization is all about younger farmers, right? That is simply not true, and that's not been our experience. In fact, we've experienced farmers across all age categories adopting technology in equal ways. And the same on the buyer side or the offtake side. We've also found there to be no discrepancy between different age groups. And I think that's quite encouraging, but it also means that it should be, technology should be available to all different participants within the chain. And perhaps just a last parting thought is around inclusivity. So of course, digitization could easily cause us to have less inclusive value chains. And the positive thing is if we look at international trends around the world, we see, particularly in developing countries where there's a lot of smallholder participation in the agricultural value chain, we see actually digitization being more successful there than actually in developed countries. And I think in a South African context, we should definitely consider how we ensure that when we digitize our value chains, that it actually leads to greater participation of smallholder farmers and marginal communities, except for it to be exclusive in a sense.
And simply because of the way that communication can be digitalized, systems can be digitalized, it lends itself to that.
You're correct. So the reason for it is because, of course, if you deal with smallholder farmers, it's smaller transactions typically. And so because you digitize a transaction, the cost of that individual transaction is less. So it means it's a lot easier for you to facilitate many smaller transactions at one go. And that's why we've seen in India, in Kenya, in China, massive adoption of digital channels for that specific reason. And I really hope that in the South African context, we'll also get it right where we really give better access to smallholder farmers in the greater value chain.
Francois, your last comments in terms of the current structure of the value chain, the opportunities in that value chain, and where should one be careful in terms of the risks in the value chain?
So it's exciting that new systems are developed. Let me take a practical example again. We're in the storage business of grain, and that has become commoditized. You can store grain alternatively in any form, so there must be some value add. So digitization brings transparency and opens that up, but it also forces you to now reinvest into old assets and bring new technology. For instance, let me again use a practical example. If you own a vehicle, a link, it costs you 5,000 Rand a day, whether you use it or whether you don't use it, fixed cost. So if I can, through investment in my silo, facilitate a quicker turnaround time, you can see that Rand per ton moving down significantly. So that's how I decommoditize a commoditized business unit. I put up bigger scales, a higher input, I increase the facility's ability to take higher moisture content, which again facilitates the farmer to get it quicker and earlier off, and use a certain pricing window earlier in March, where the prices are normally higher. So it's an exciting world.
Yeah. It's not, it comes down to adding value.
Absolutely, and you do the analysis. So, I mean, I've invested in my business 1.2 billion Rand just in the last few years in old silo systems to push up that value, and you'll see our results will be published within a month. So that investment again brings better returns. So it's a dynamic world we're living in, but it's exciting world, and it's so nice to see. If I can use the extreme example, a kid playing video games today, how can he or she be part of a value chain tomorrow by maybe steering a driverless vehicle in an orchard? So it's an exciting world we live in.
Certainly exciting world. It's a changing world. And with change comes opportunity. And we need to be open. There is opportunities. We have world-class farmers and we have a world-class value chain. But that also means we need to stay on top of the world, and we need to make sure that the value chain is efficient. In the end, we want sustainable producers in a sustainable value chain. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience. Thank you for coming around. And let's give my panel a hand. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot.